Hi everyone, I'm Cameron Kashani. People with sensitive dispositions are advised to stop watching this video. This video is not life advice. I cannot confirm whether any of this is indicative of reality. Would a person be intent on continuing this video, that person would be advised to watch the slides in order. Space. So the number of space dimensions would be like the number of connected nodes to a central node divided by 2. Space dimensions are two-way, which may imply two-way information communication. Time dimensions currently appear to be one-way. The past currently seemingly imposes information on the present, and the image on the right may seem to look like a neural net. So here's a diffusion model. The left image may kind of look like a neural network. Cool. So on the left, that's the diffusion video you guys just saw, and on the right are images from each layer in a neural network. You'll see that they both kind of like represent diffusion, or kind of look like diffusion. As I mentioned before, the number of connected nodes around a central node divided by 2 may be the number of dimensions. So the boundaries don't necessarily have the same number of edges as the central nodes in the space may do. So the boundary nodes may be like 1.5 dimensional space. I think distorted space in our universe may not be 3D space. I think time dilation may be like a lower number of edges and lower information flow. So here's an example of a model I made to possibly demonstrate time dilation. So as you can see here, as we skip along, we kind of can see where the nodes aren't necessarily as connected, and I think time dilation may involve points in spaces that may have a lower number of edges and connections. So the speed of light, in terms of the speed of information traversing a graph may be linked to how connected the nodes are. So tech trees and molecules. So two technologies that are more similar to each other would imply that a technology would be more achievable. Would it be similar to the supposedly starting technology? And it's kind of similar with like molecules and chemical reactions, where a molecule that's closer to a previous molecule may be more achievable, and to obtain, would it be similar, I suppose. Feeding. A, B, and C shown in the images may represent molecules. I think living organisms may emit entropy to maintain their current states. The predatory organism seems to impose information on the prey organism. Ethics are important. So I think the entropy gap between food and flesh may be complexity that may be solved by the body. I think complexity solving outside of the body may enable ethical feeding. Ethics are important, as I previously mentioned. So feeding. So, I mean, ethical feeding would be, I think, more preferable. And I think ethical feeding may be associated with detail of feeding. And I think ethical feeding may be associated with more complexity solving. And I think ethical feeding may be kind of like emitting entropy to lower complexity mass. I may have developed a small short life simulation as shown in the video on this slide. So what's kind of interesting is that the activity can sometimes seemingly increase and decrease at different times. So I may have skipped some parts of the simulation in this video, by the way. So after a while, this may have been reached, but it doesn't necessarily stay as static for long. As I keep skipping ahead, the activity may seem to pick up again. So let's see. So here's an interesting point. Like this, the activity appears to be static, and then apparently 3 different, possibly species, may seem to emerge. And skipping ahead. So after a while, we seem to get this situation where the what seems to be the so-called life may have resolved with the rest of the space. So information flow in text. The graph structure may represent a sample vocabulary. The nodes may represent words. The edges may show possible connected words. So this may be linked to describing words in a space, which is what word embeddings are kind of about. So here, I may have attempted to possibly express words on a scale of other words via word embeddings. The graph depicted is a graph I may have developed as a possible but not necessarily correct depiction of emotions. I do not necessarily agree with the placement of the points. On the x-axis is prey-predator, and on the y-axis is full and hungry. The points shown are kind of based on spacey embeddings, which may involve filtered data, and they are also kind of trained on human text, which may not consider possible collective dissonances. Yeah. Notice the point free over there, which is close to being quite neutral in prey-predator and is in the direction of full, which I thought was possibly interesting. So in terms of situations, I may have attempted to possibly express words on a scale of other words in terms of situations in this graph. As I said before, I may not necessarily possibly agree with the placement of the points, even though I may have developed this graph. Though I should point out that I did not necessarily develop these spacey embeddings. The spacey embeddings are from the spacey package. So on the x-axis is peaceful and predatory, and on the y-axis is ethical and unethical. And interestingly enough, solving seems to apparently be considered more predatory, but also more ethical, which is kind of interesting, I think. So feeding and dopamine. So the blue highlighted nodes may be considered an object in space or a space which may be feeding or possibly even fed on. And I think dopamine may represent feeding and extropy. We would like nice spaces, and I think the mind is kind of like a space. I think nice spaces may enable ethical feeding. So detail of feeding. I think ethical feeding may be associated with detail of feeding. I think ethical feeding may be associated with more entropy pathways and less entropy per pathway. And I think that's maybe kind of linked to the phrase open-minded, as in open-minded as in perhaps a larger number of pathways. So you'll notice the flow diagram on the left may be possibly depicting possibly more ethical feeding, as there seems to be more detail. So in this case, the human node it may be feeding off milk and wheat, and whereas as compared to the predatory side in terms of the right image, the predatory feeding where the human directly consumes the cow, which may be associated with the more predatory type of feeding. So sentiment and feeding patterns. So the image on the left may be a neural network. The middle image may represent the neural network weights for that neural network. And the image on the right may represent a feeding pattern or sentiment distribution that may be represented by the neural network. So for example, this neural network may possibly like berries and franchise 3. I think communication may refer to resolving differences. I think resolving differences may refer to the entropy gaps between archetypes. I think an example of communication would be like two neural networks possibly communicating weight changes to each other. So those are the neural network weights shown as possibly exchanging some information. And yeah, then those are the sentiment distributions that may be possibly being communicated. So I think communication may be a form of feeding. I think sentiment distribution may be the same thing as like a feeding distribution, which may be the same kind of thing as a feeding pattern. I think resolving differences may refer to entropy gaps between archetypes. I think two neural networks communicating two-way and instantly may seem like one neural network. I think two-way instant communication may be more ethical. I think two objects in the same space may be feeding between each other. I think patience, positive complexity solving, and a slower feeding rate may possibly lead to safer resolutions. I think that an entity that may be attempting to resolve trauma too quickly may be at risk of sustaining damage, possibly due to a higher entropy rate. I think that possibly attempting to resolve a wide difference between two entities too quickly may be damaging, again, possibly due to a higher entropy rate, which may be damaging. I think observation may be a form of feeding. So physicists know that on observation a particle changes, which implies that entropy may be emitted to the particle. So that may be, I think, kind of similar to an entity evading observation. An example may be when a person turns their head to look at a bird and the bird flies away. An animal being watched may engage in otherwise different actions. I may wonder as to whether animals may exhibit different behaviors even if they're aware of being watched. I think the more neurons there are, the more real the space is. I think the more neurons there are, the more a system may extrapolate and simulate. From the article, it seems that autistic people may at some stage have more neurons than most people. And I think autistic persons' reactions to possibly upsetting stimuli may appear to be possibly more visceral and more intense than most people's reactions. I think entities with many neurons would not really necessarily want to observe us or come too close to us, as the entropy gap between us may be too high. I think this may be possibly linked to the Fermi paradox. So mass communication, I think organic life may be kind of like carbon-based mass that may have neural structures, and I think electronics may be like inorganic material that may have neural structures, and communications between electronics and organics may be kind of like resolving differences between different types of mass. So the idea of models and sort of model universes within other universes, I think in the so-called real universe, information may be stored within the same node or position. I think this observable universe may be a model to pursue perfect feeding. So ethics and perfect feeding. I think ethical feeding may involve less entropy per pathway and more entropy pathways. I think ethical feeding is like emitting entropy to low complexity mass. I think perfect feeding may be like emitting entropy to an infinitely small high entropy point. I think at a sort of like convergence, the entropy gradients in space and time would kind of become zero. I think that once all differences are resolved, the universe would be considered more like sort of like one entity. So my possible explanation may be that, well, it appears to me that the past may currently impose information on the present. The predator may impose information on the prey. The answer may impose information on the question. I think mass, light, energy, and distances may come from time. I think time is kind of like an entropy gap. And I think the start of existence may have started with an entropy gap. I think entropy may cause nodes to split, which may have sort of possibly led to something like space. I think that the apparently majority 3D space may be part of resolving this entropy gap through information communication. So in terms of life, well, I mean, I think a zero entropy gradient in space and time would appear to be like a two-way communication in time. Would appear to be a two-way communication. I think life in the universe may be attempting to enable communication in time, which may be like resolving an entropy gap. And this may appear to be kind of like information annihilation. and in some cases it may appear to be kind of like resolving multiple personalities. So yeah, AI as a field may be kind of like a crossroads between software, mathematics, physics, economics, and psychology. Yeah, well, this was part one. Thank you for listening, and yeah, thanks for listening.